It's not about not finding the talent. There is a lot of talent actually in the market, I think, from this perspective. But it's finding whom do you really need? How do you build these data capabilities, which are very new, even still new for many companies, and how it evolves, over these years, with AI, with so many breakthrough technologies coming every couple of years and kind of shaking the entire thing. Yet you're still focusing like, how do I get value out of this? If I would say number one thing, it's empathy and ability to be empathetic to the candidate.
We are live on the Objective Hiring Show. Today we're joined by Aleksej. Aleksej, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tim.
It is wonderful to have you here with us today. And where I typically start is just trying to get a sense of the guest and who are we speaking to today. So I'd love to hear just a bit of an introduction about yourself so our audience can start to understand who they're listening to.
Sure, absolutely. So my name is Aleksej, as you said already. I've been whole my life in data. It's kind of happened, very timely that graduating university, software engineering became one big theme. And so I got this career start in software engineering, specifically in, database development and things like this. And then it took me, from all this type of famous places like Nokia was one big company with a lot of presence in the world. And then I moved to Oracle Technologies. Again, in our kind of milestone for all the data people, used to be most interesting data warehousing solutions, 20 years back and so on. And then, I've definitely get a consultancy arm, like I think many of us. So I've been part of Accenture as well. And so finally I've landed at Microsoft, and I spent then 15 years at Microsoft. And my role in Microsoft was really to build those data foundations for the company. To create that notion of data being used by the business units, by building that competitive advantage. And this involved technical capabilities. It's involving building the large team across the world, which would be kind of a central team those days for the company, and many other aspects. But it was really about kind of getting value out of the data. And so I think this happened really nicely with Microsoft. So I love that story. I love that story to the extent that I even wrote a book about this. So it's called Data Management Strategy by Microsoft, available, on Amazon. But it was really that type of, reflection of how do you build these data capabilities, which are very new, even still new for many companies. And how it evolves, over these years, with AI, with so many breakthrough technologies coming every couple of years and kind of shaking the entire thing. Yet you're still focusing like, how do I get value out of this? So that's Aleksej.
Thanks for that introduction. That's awesome. And I think an interesting place to start now that you've kind of painted that picture is I'd love to get your thoughts on something that I've always thought was a little bit odd. And so I'd just love to hear your reaction to this. So most leaders would say that finding and hiring the best people is, if not their number one goal, number one objective, certainly in the top three most important things they're focused on. Without the right people, everything else is a lot harder. And you've just, painted this picture of all these advancements in data happening over the past 20 years, with AI now being used in all these different bits of life and technology and product and marketing in day-to-day everything. And yet not really when it comes to people. Like most of the hiring decisions companies make tend to be, if it's a spectrum of data driven to intuition based, very far along the intuition based end of the spectrum. This varies. Like when I've heard of people who've been at Amazon and maybe some of the big tech, they do it in a more regimented kind of data driven way. But I think for most businesses, they use a really intuitive based approach. Is that going to change? Like, do you think we're getting to a stage with the development of AI and data where actually we could have the same quality of data about people as we do about other things? It might open up a new wave of kind of making data-driven decisions about people in hiring. Yeah, what are your kind of thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we should get some advancements, certainly. The power of AI in connecting the dots or extracting some dependencies, some interdependencies of human knowledge, human profile. It certainly should help. On the other hand, what I see today as probably the number large challenge in the companies which operates with data is really on that kind of a product manager, technical product manager, whatever we call it. So the person who builds the bridges between the domain knowledge, the business kind of knowledge, like why the company exists, like what it wants to do with that data, and then actual technical teams which are responsible for the technical implementation of the data. And so in these places, I wouldn't say that intuition is the number one thing, but it's certainly a very complex knowledge which is difficult to qualify or classify very explicitly. It's a mixture of like how do you understand that the person really have that domain knowledge or have that business knowledge. Now you can check on certain data aspects, but it's not the technical assessment you do. You do more like a bridge between the technical capability of the soft skill capabilities like selling or storytelling. And so assessing this objectively with some AI capabilities, I think we're a bit far away from it. And this is where I feel that this intuition, it's not an intuition in a pure way, but this, the feel of the managers who've been through it, kind of like feel that type of a personality fit versus, knowledge versus experience. That's what kind of is under that intuition, so to say.
As you were describing that kind of person who's the bridge between the domain or business knowledge and the technical side, that resonated with me because it's a role I'd played in a business in the past where I knew enough about the domain, had enough technical skills where I can kind of do a bit of both and sort of cross over and wear both hats. What about this idea? If the technical skills can become almost commoditized now with a large language model, will Claude be doing most of the coding in a year and you're just prompting something else to write the coding? Is there almost something to be said for then domain experts who now don't need to interface with technical people because they're interfacing with an AI, and now maybe that's opening up new opportunities because you don't need those two very different skill sets that rarely overlap?
I don't think so. For a number of reasons, honestly. I think that with the whole help of AI, and I'm really, a big believer into the AI technology and like what it could do for us. I think it will take a while, to really get to the point that it's not like an assistant, but it's truly kind of leads with the development of, the technical capabilities and so on. And, it's still about so much of understanding the technology behind to be able to be relevant to those business needs. Yeah. So we see today this in a very simple conversations, which happens, I think, in every room across most of the enterprises in the world. The leadership comes and say, oh, we need to have an AI product, right? It could be for the internal use or for the, external for customers. And it sparkles a lot of those conversations. And it's actually first and foremost goes in understanding what's possible with the technology and how this could be enabled. And I think this will not disappear. So people, first of all, should be able to explain the technology, to understand like what is possible, what's not, where the limitations are. Otherwise, they will be drawn into the wrong directions and wrong decision. And then they should see, okay, how does this really maps to that business opportunity? Like what we can scope out and crystallize and power with that technology, right? And what we're missing or what we need, from implementation perspective. So I would say we are just maybe getting a little more help going forward with, streamlining our work with automation of certain tasks. But I won't see in a year or two from now the radical change in the way how we work.
I interviewed someone recently, a gentleman called Artem Koren, who runs a business called Assembly.ai, and they are kind of like a Fireflies. They're a note-taking app that you invite to your meeting. It does the transcription of the meeting. It does the summarization. It does the action points you agreed upon, integrates into task management software, so it kind of goes to the next step. And he was a really interesting character. And the way he described the change that we're seeing now is that, imagine we had this special coworker who we needed to set up some conditions for them to be able to do their best work. Maybe they needed like a certain kind of desk, or they needed to be in a certain quiet space of the office or whatever. So we made accommodations for them, but they're amazing. So they're kind of worth it. That was the picture he was painting with AI, that we need to kind of rethink how we run businesses to leverage this infinitely scalable colleague that we're about to have, and kind of rethink from the ground how we structure our businesses. Do you agree with that, or do you feel like we're not at that point yet? How do you view things?
We're moving towards that point. I would, as of today, like this, 25th of February, I would say we're not there yet, right? And it's a matter of, certain things. The technology itself, pretty much there. So if you think about this digital employee, this multi-agent type of capability, which creates a certain identity and very task-focused, and actually successfully task-focused. And so the current AI capabilities we use is Gen AI models and so on. They're very good at resolving tasks. And so if you define this and you base it very much on the understanding of the language or understanding of the text, so again, where the original technology comes from, then it's pretty good. Where it comes on is the adoption, right? And the adoption means that to integrate such a capability into your work, you have to get pretty much digitalized everything in the company. So you have to get the digital processes up and running. You have to get also that ability to tap into various aspects of the data, not only to source it, kind of for read-only way. If we think about the classical analytical dashboards, which every company, so far kind of got already, it's just a read-only. So you generate some insights, but you rarely have the mechanism which pushes immediately some action based on this, right? So here we're talking that we actually do a lot of physical move, of the knowledge, of the data, of the processes through these digital agents. So this is not enabled in majority of the companies. And then I would say also the cultural aspect of this, right? So you have to get that cultural adoption that, the people would really be, ready, knowledgeable, educated, how to work with the digital employees. So if you take this adoption kind of a whole concept, and how much we need from enablement perspective, how much we need from, people side of this, then we are very far from this concept. Albeit from technology perspective, yes, we can push this.
That's very interesting, that analysis then, because straight away I'm thinking, okay, so if you're in a large organization where, of course, things don't change that quickly, there's the cultural adoption you're mentioning, there's the kind of pushback, risk aversion, data privacy, lack of digitization, all those kinds of things. Well, if you're a startup, you don't have any of that. If you're starting right now, you can define your business afresh and go, well, we're going to record every single meeting ever had in this company. 100% of everything's going to be online, purely digital. We're going to start from afresh, build everything from the assumption that most of our colleagues will be AI, not humans, which I doubt many companies have ever started that way with that assumption. I wonder if then there's going to be some sudden wave of startups that are just going to come through and wipe out any, 20 or 30-year-old tech company that's still stuck in what will now be the past.
That's a great point. I think, in theory, yes. As far as you're in control of your own world in a startup, surely what you just described, is happening already somewhere, and probably pretty actively happening. But then what's going next is that you're living out of that world of your own controls. And so you have to get either to, a space where our company is already dominating, already working with existing customers and so on. You start to serve the others. And if those others, they don't have those digital ready interfaces, which you can easily tap through, then your work is, not really valid, right? So to me, this is this moment where, we have to get the overall momentum across, multiple, digital industries, which then kind of moves more or less along. Just to have a couple of startups which have completely different environment, and they rely on a lot on digital agents and digital employees. That's fantastic. But like, does this really make an impact for those whom they serve or those whom they cooperate with? And does this change those large companies where a majority of the people works? So that's kind of the thing, that again, it's good to have a super tech which leads the way and shows, like what could be done. But to really get that motion with the technology, to say that, we are leveraging now these digital employees successfully, I think this is still years to come.
What about in terms of the hiring process itself? Have you started to dabble with any AI hiring tools? Have you seen any candidates starting to use these tools as part of their application process? And what's your current read on AI in hiring?
I think it's currently a little bit of that kind of a try and fail thing. So candidates try to use AI to, improve their readability, improve the positioning, improve, certain correlations of the thing. And then employers using AI to do absolutely the opposite, right? To kind of unwind like what was the true. Yeah. So what's there, like certain scanning mechanisms again. So I think we need to get to certain maturity in that space, right? And I'm not sure for regulations as such, but I think it's more about the maturity in seeing like where it's really helps. Because in theory, both the employee, future employee, and the employer, they are interested to get a good match. And so this is what I would say AI might try to help the most, is to create, this good match based on maybe certain things which are not so visible for, for a human or for the recruiter, right? Because again, when you think through, I reflecting back on the processes which we had at Microsoft. So if I need to hire somebody, I would first write a certain, job description, which is fully in my language, in the way how we use it for ourselves. Yeah, it's rarely would be from the industry perspective, maybe a little bit, but it would be full of a jargon and and internal acronyms and stuff like this. Then we would have a recruiter who would pass this through and say like, oh, on the market you should call this position slightly different, or you should remove this acronym and replace it with the other acronym. Yeah, so it starts. So if you look then on this modified description, you see already, okay, it's not exactly mine, but it's also not for recruiters anymore. And so it's kind of in between, which not really makes sense anymore, native for me, native for him. But nevertheless, we go with this to the hiring side, right? So we post this on LinkedIn, and then again, there is no match automatically or no mapping between those skills which the candidates would have with what you post on LinkedIn. So it's again this type of dancing between like, what does this really mean? There's operations. Operations are used in so many contexts. Or I have to do the data analytics again. It's a very different skill depending on like what you're hiring for in the context. So I think a lot of these things get kind of lost in translation at the end. And then this is what I see this as a challenge where AI might help, in theory at least, through navigating that language and that ability to kind of see the context. Yeah. So like the tone even or the connections between certain capabilities and highlight them up, to say like, well, out of those, 120, 200, 300 resumes which you received, there is some human objective in this, and there is some AI assessment in this. And maybe this AI assessment can show up certain things which human will not see.
Yeah, and I suspect this technology is being built at the moment. I've certainly spoken to a lot of people about this. I know some applicant tracking systems have started to kind of dabble in that kind of AI-based resume screening. I feel like one of the key problems is going to be with this kind of matching challenge. You got job on one side, candidates on the other, is at the moment the data available to do that matching, whether it's done by a human and AI or anything in between, is kind of crap, because it's someone's written a resume about themselves, and on a resume I could claim to be a rocket scientist and nobody can really say no at that point. And as you described before, that job description becomes almost like through time some kind of Frankenstein description that maybe doesn't actually represent perfectly reality. And it's only a summary anyway. You can't go into all the details. So is there something to be said for we need to get better quality data on both sides of that matching to have any hope of doing it more accurately with AI or any kind of automation?
I would say so, but I would also say that it depends on the context of the hiring, right? There are industries which matured very, very well, and they do have a very solid understanding of what are those positions, what are those skills which they are hiring for. Yeah. So my wife works in the retail per se, and so retail is already a very well organized environment. So you have this pretty clear classification of what's the people role in the shop, right? There is a store manager, there is some area district manager. So those roles are very well defined. They've been there for years, yeah? So they evolved, but they have that maturity and understanding. And when we go into these technology things, and a lot of roles today on LinkedIn and so on, they are kind of technology related. And this is where we're coming to that what you just said, this mapping, this understanding of what has been done in one company with the one terminology is possibly fully transferable to another company with very different terminology. But because of this terminology is so different, and there is no translation layer as such, this looks as absolutely two different things. This is what we have today a lot, right? Or we have this mismatch again of those skills where people are calling out certain skills and certain proficiency in those skills. There is no that type of a universal way how to assess them. There is no enough certification, there is no enough maturity in easy way to say what is your level of proficiency, let's say in data quality, right? Or what is your proficiency in data analytics? It's super dependent actually on which tools you use, what company you work for. So it's too much into the context, into the weeds versus upfront in the resume.
And to go back to your example before, with you mentioned your wife working in retail, and maybe that's a more settled environment. The job descriptions are more consistent across different companies. But does the same problem still kind of exist? Yeah, you don't have that matching between different companies' explanation of the same job, but still it would be a challenge to match a job to a candidate to one of hundreds of resumes, because the resume is just a representation of someone about themselves. Like, you could include or exclude any information you want, which may or may not give the kind of full picture, if you see what I mean.
True, but I think it's still much easier, because there is more of that repetitiveness of the things. There are more of those kind of templates, almost to say, which fits. Yeah. So even a candidate takes the some existing position on the LinkedIn, it looks like what they're asking for, and they start to reply in the same way, in their CV, in their resume, and so this creates a type of a reusability of the same things going through. And what I've saw on the other hand is in technology companies and in many, places where we do need quick technology, we see that it is a mess. There are no standardized, in a good way, standardized job descriptions. It's not about an HR work doing, in-house standardization of the disciplines and so on. It's important, but I'm talking about mapping this to the external world. Can we have that place like LinkedIn or something else, which will eventually be this translation kind of capability to map those skills, which you need in a company versus what's available in the market, and kind of clearly identify, how they work, what's the different maturity of those skills, and so where you need to go. And I think one other thing, Tim, as well on this, there is more ambiguity, I think, generally, right? If you take back on those roles which are well situated for years, they have a less ambiguity. And with all this, technology related, world, and, and data and AI in particular, as well as the leadership roles, there is much more ambiguity. And this ambiguity, it kind of chimes in, and it creates that extra complexity and extra mess in trying to map the things through.
And part of the origin of that ambiguity, I guess, is because certainly, even in my life in data, the roles have changed completely. There weren't so many roles now. There weren't so many roles 10 years ago as there are now. They've kind of been divided up software engineering, I'm sure 30 years ago, it's not like there was front end dev, back end dev, database, DevOps, It was more like a jack of all trades kind of role. And so maybe just because the roles have changed so much and they're always changing, it's hard for companies to keep up as well.
Absolutely. And this is what we see with proliferation of these roles in, the definition of some new roles, which kind of nobody even understands like what's behind this. So some company comes with an idea that they would like to have an, I don't know, AI evangelist. Yeah. So who is AI evangelist?
Good question. Are you?
Well, maybe, let's look at a job description, right? So that's the thing. So you pick up something which maybe is very innovative, but it doesn't have any grounds, right? It doesn't have any mapping kind of a capability to the rest of the world.
Speaking of that, actually, I've spoken to a few analytics leaders recently who have mentioned they've noticed a trend for companies who are trying to make their first data hire, their first analytics hire. These are companies that are maybe, 50, 100, 200 people. They haven't ventured into that yet. And they run into a bit of an issue, which is that they don't have anyone in their current team who could help define that role. The people who would help define that role would be the person they're hiring. So they're stuck in this kind of circular death loop. And so they don't really know what they're looking for. Have you seen any way out of that for these companies? Like, do they need to engage, I don't know, an external consultant or something? Because their talent team won't know the answer to this either.
Yeah, this is a difficult question. And I think certain help externally would absolutely be needed. The way of using this help probably will be the most important, right? So you said external consultants. I have nothing against the external consultancy. I would just be very curious, like how to map it to the exact objective, right? So this consultancy ideally should be connected to what the company wants to achieve with it, first data approach and so on. And sometimes it's a very specific, so they lack certain capabilities. So we've been using this, externally, and now they need to kind of bring it more in-house or, double down on this or something. But if it's really like they never touched that and they just starting to explore, the world of analytics or something, then it will be important to see that it's a match with the business expectations, right? Because the business expectations from this or leadership expectations could be quite different. And that's, I think, the biggest issue here, right? It's not about not finding the talent. There is a lot of talent actually in the market, I think, from this perspective. But it's finding like whom do you really need? Like, do you need more as a kind of a startup leader who will organize everything? Do you need a great storyteller which will help, to defend those investments and kind of land it very well with the growing business needs and so on? Do you need a technical person because you really need to go more into those technical foundations? So I think we rarely will find those unicorns. And even if the companies are finding those unicorns, then in your example, those type of businesses, they will immediately say, wow, that's too expensive. so we're kind of going back. Okay, so if you have this unicorn who can do it, everything, from leadership to technical acumen and so on, but that's like too much money. So then you need to, kind of find those trade-off things. And that's where, connection to the real business needs and like why, this fundamental why question, like why are you investing suddenly into the data? If you need a quick thing out of this, maybe it's not about having a full-time position. Maybe you just should buy this as a service or something, right? So that type of level of granularity would be very important.
You mentioned the why and coming back to that. And I feel like if I think back to my last 10 years really of working on this business and working in a previous business, hiring processes that derail and go badly, I feel like the root cause of that is often we didn't think of the why in enough detail. We didn't really meditate. What are we trying to hire someone because we've got 500 Jira tickets and we just want to bash through them quicker? Are we hiring someone because I'm doing some tedious manual task and I want someone else to take that pain off my plate? Like why exactly are we hiring? And then that leads to like, okay, we're hiring this role. What exactly are their responsibilities? What exactly are their skills? And I feel like if that step is ever kind of skipped over or done in a like, oh yeah, here you go, here's a job description that I found from 3 years ago, just use this, then everything after that is almost doomed to fail. Have you noticed? Have you noticed this?
We've been quite lucky at Microsoft doing this entire hiring process very differently. And I will not say it's a best practice, but I will say that it at least had no question of why. And to explain this, so we relied a lot on the externals. So every team, would have by default pretty small amount of full-time employees, but we would have a lot of externals. And we would have externals as just agency employees, or we also could have, the suppliers, like a big names working closely with us. And we would observe that delivery and that talent for years. And as you observe, as you see, how we grow, people take some more leadership roles, they create some innovation, they really stand out in this. So you constantly see those type of top talent things appearing in that whole big delivery space. And then you kind of can pick this up and say, oh, actually, you know why? I know why. I want you specifically because I've seen you for, 3-5 years delivering great work in this environment. And so now we understand that the person would have, terrific IP already with them. They are absolute fit because we loved, their contributions and everything. So we'll kind of then poach over to the Microsoft. And that's exactly also was for me, the same way. So I was an Accenture consultant. I was brought in the Microsoft environment. They absorbed this for a couple of years and say, hey, come over, right? So, there is no question of why in this case, but this is not a strategy for everybody. On the other hand, this type of approach where you can really observe people for a long period of time and you see how they're performing and then you're choosing, the best out of the best already. That's, a big privilege to have this type of capabilities.
And speaking of the approach at Microsoft, when it comes to hiring, was it I'm assuming, fairly well-structured approach where everyone went through like a consistent set of interviews and interviewers were trained and you were asking specific things within a framework? Was it that kind of approach as opposed to the, more gut feel, intuitive, I'm just going to get a feel for the person and give them a job or not?
How do you think?
Definitely the first one, I'm assuming. Was it a hiring machine? Is that what it was like?
I I would say it's 30% of a hiring machine and then 70% of kind of selecting by that feel and fit.
Oh, really?
Well, we had a structured approach, let's say, so not to derail from this completely. We had a structured approach where the people would be interviewed, by a different person. So we select probably, 4 or 5 people within our team. We would assign each of them some specific set of skills to watch, right? They wouldn't interview just for that. They wouldn't start, the conversation with a candidate saying like, hey, I'm interviewing you from the perspective of, technical depth or something, right? But they would kind of observe certain skills, like how they are more come up and so on. So it gives us ability, to remain a human in the interviews while also focusing maybe on 1 or 2 things only without kind of over analyzing or over processing, everything which we hear and see. We will do the, kind of recap afterwards between all of the participants and, highlight some strengths and so on. But, at the end, it was so much about a fit. And this fit, as you can sense, was not defined exactly by those capabilities. So if something was fundamental and missing, or in conflict, or kind of looking shaky, then for sure this will be called out. But if everything is equally good across the candidates, we'll discuss a lot of that, kind of team fit, cultural fit, and I will tell you, it is a good reason for this. I think that the branding, like this Microsoft brand, it was so strong, or is still very strong, that the people would come to the company just because they want to be hired by Microsoft, right? This is the fundamental kind of a thing for many, independently of like what's the position is, the location, the skill sets, the interest, actually completing this work within that given team environment. They just want desperately to be hired by Microsoft. And so these type of things, we had to watch for this a lot, right? And this is where you assess it objectively from, candidate skill set perspective and so on. But you also focus a lot at the end on like, okay, would this be a fit? Or would the person just use this for any opportunity to get into the company and then, move immediately to some different roles and stuff like this. So you have a lot of this kind of back processing, which is really what then influences that decision of hire or not hire.
And just so I understand correctly, if you sense that someone they're just desperate to work for Microsoft, is that a green flag or a red flag?
That's a great question. It depends.
A true consultant's answer.
Yeah, in most cases, it will be more like a red flag, honestly. In the sense that it's just overrides and kind of overshadows everything else, right? So what we always looking for is that, yes, the whole willingness to work for the company, the interest, but it's more of interest in that role, in the team, in that impact to be created. Yeah, this is what will be the most fundamental and most interesting. And if we hear is a little bit too much of that constant kind of a notion of like, yeah, but it would be great to work such a technology leaders, or something else comes up, with compensation things, or some other flexibilities and so on. This then like triggers like, okay, what's the true motivation? Yeah, so this notion of like, what's the true motivation? And for us also involves teams. Hiring process always was important, right? So we do this investments very deliberately. So we want to get the best out of the best and kind of have it immediately there, just I think many. So that purpose kind of a match would be very important. And if it's overly indexed on that company in a more global way versus in the particular role, and ability to create an impact within that role, yeah, we will see it more as a red flag.
Just thought of an analogy to dating, and I'm going to throw this out there, and it's just popped into my mind, so it may make no sense, but it's kind of like being in love with the idea of someone rather than them their self, if you see what I mean. You want someone who's actually interested in the specific role in the team rather than, oh, Microsoft, oh, like the brand name. Is that the sense?
Yeah, exactly. Yes, indeed.
Uh, One thing I'd love to ask you about is interviewing, because most companies, I would say, the the main evaluation tool that they would use in the hiring process really still is interviewing with humans. Yes, they might use a skills assessment, IQ test, personality test, but I've not met a company that didn't use interviews and didn't place the majority of their weighting on the interview performance. So I think it's still very important. You must have done a lot of interviews yourself. You must have sat in on a lot of interviews where other people were driving. If you think across your career, what is separating a really great interviewer, as in the one asking the questions, a great interviewer from an okay interviewer?
If I would say number one thing, it's empathy and ability to be empathetic to the candidate, and kind of let things come up. Open these conversations. Have this ability for people to feel good and talk about like what they can do. Yeah, I've seen variety of the strategies. I've seen people creating some stress on the candidates. I don't understand why. I mean, like, really. I've seen also a lot of that structured approach, or people desperately want to get some answers, and then at the end they give some free room. I don't think it works. You don't get much of that, like what's the person actually is, besides just getting some stuff to you, which you even unlikely to get able to process quickly. Yeah. So I think that conversational ability and being empathetic to the candidate and let people open up, talk their stories, like talk their examples, get to the point, like what they actually are as a people. What is that baggage of the soft skills which we brings in? What is that technical skills which bring in? We can talk about this again, and the technical skills maybe deeper in some more specific assessment. But if we're talking about the interviewing as such, it won't be really about the technical skills most time. It will be maybe a couple of questions just to quickly kind of arrange, like, do you know what's this, what's that, so that type of things. But then it goes really into that personality deeper. And for this, you need to get people open up.
Yes, because I think part of the difficulty in interviews is that I'd say both sides of the table have a bit of a mask on. Like, we're not necessarily being fully 100% transparent. We're not just putting all our cards on the table. And yeah, you want to really get to the truth of who they are, as you said, their motivations and what they're interested in. Do you have any techniques for doing that in particular? Any ways to almost make the candidate feel relaxed and calm and really open up to you?
Um, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, what we try to typically to create, we try to explain a lot about what we do, right? Like, what is the role, what type of work we do, what's the impact, how this operates, and so on. And you start to see already this reflection from the people, if they like it, yeah, if they hear something which matches their aspiration, or their work of doing this, they jumping in and say like, oh, that's like that's exactly what I was doing, right? And they bring those examples straight on and so on. And so you kind of lead this conversation more by creating that space where we can tap and talk about their achievements, versus you kind of go, this brutally up front and say, okay, tell me your top 5 projects you have been completed, or something like this. This is awkward, right? So I think that's what created this true ability for people to shine with their realistic and relevant examples, also matching what we're trying to create in our site as a potential working environment.
I wanted to lay one idea at you, and this is partly, again, based on a conversation I've had recently with another guest, where they described their overall hiring philosophy for 20 or 30 years was to identify the diamonds in the rough, which for them were the candidates that would be almost like systematically undervalued by the market in some way. And for him, that was people who would be really great at their job, but interview terribly. So let's say very like cripplingly introverted people, people who maybe aren't great communicators in general, maybe some people a bit more on the spectrum and just don't really want to deal with the difficulty of meeting all these strangers and having all these questions probed at them. Is there something to be said for the fact that we almost like over indexed on interviews as an evaluation tool, and we're kind of accidentally filtering out all these people who would otherwise be amazing, especially in very technical roles, not consulting roles where you have to deal with people all day, but like super technical roles? Is there something to be said for being conscious of the hiring process?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm totally with you that the hiring process itself should be super conscious, right? In terms of what kind of skills required for what type of job. The cultural background as well. I mean, the cultural, not only background, but the cultural settings. Yeah. So when we worked across the whole world. So I had the people in Germany, in France, in Australia, in Singapore, in the US, and so it's a very different cultural background and settings of how people actually work in generally in the country. What's important to them. So when you do this type of interviews, you have to get that whole kind of settings up front, and you have to understand what you will be asking different questions, or you will be asking, let's say, questions differently to the people in Singapore versus people in US. And so that's something which is important, to always have this very clear distinguishment, like what is what we're hiring for, what is what we're looking for from, skill, personality, influence perspective, how much it is important, right? So we don't pick up to this point where like, oh, I just don't like that person. Yeah, it doesn't matter, do you like a person or not? Yeah, we have first of all to understand, is the person actually a good candidate and qualified to do the job, right? This aspect of like or dislike doesn't have any significant stand in that space. Yeah? And so this is also for for the managers and for the people who are participating in the interview. It's so important to step back from this. Yeah, like, I really like that person. Yeah, okay, what were skills there? Well, I don't know. We just had a great conversation. Yeah. Well, for some roles, it could be a perfect, yeah, for a sales role. This could be a perfect, kind of a testimonial, but maybe for some other roles, it's not.
Yeah, and this is where personally I feel like we shouldn't get too hung up on things that are inherently subjective because I feel like they could be twisted very easily. So let's say you've got cultural fit, I think would be the main one, where unless you've defined that quite concretely and you've really thought, no, no, here's like the 5 values we're selecting for, here's the questions we're going to ask to evaluate these things, unless you box it somehow, I think it's so easy for someone just to come back with that kind of feedback, which is basically, I don't like them. They won't be a good cultural fit here. But yeah, like why? There's got to be some kind of evidence at least, surely.
Exactly. And I think this selection of also the personalities who doing the interview is also important here, right? So if there is if there is an opportunity to select, different and people with a different leadership style for doing those interviews, I would absolutely recommend it. Right. So, and I did this, so we had, number of peers, which which were different people from, the way they operate and lead, the teams and so on. And it was always super important to get that, different perspectives and, accumulate them and decide afterwards, but at least to capture it, not to go into one very, skewed direction because, everybody who was interviewing was the same style type of persona.
Right. So a bit of diversity in every sense of the word in the interview panel, because then you're going to get a wider array of views.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Uh, Alexei, if you could ask our next guest one question about hiring, what would you like to ask them?
I would ask, what was their best hire and why?
A fantastic question, and not one we've had, and not one I've asked any guest. That's a great one. It made me think about my own hires, and I've in the past tended to think more about the fails rather than the successes. So it's a nice reframing you've given me, actually.
Let's be positive, right?
Yes. Okay. Great. I'm excited to ask that to our next guest at some point in the next week or so, and I'll share their answer with you. Alexei, it's been a great conversation today. I've really enjoyed speaking to you and tapping into all your knowledge and skills and wisdom in this area, and I'm sure our audience have enjoyed it as well.
Thank you, Tim. It was glad to be here.